Paul George was sort of the domino that we were waiting to fall, because as the biggest free agent in the class, a lot of teams and players were sort of waiting on seeing what the market looked like. And it was very clear that from the second free agency started, again, it was a little bit slow, off the jump. But one thing that was pretty clear even before we got any definitive news is that it was unexpected that Paul George would be returning to the Clippers based off of a dispute in terms of whether or not there was going to be a fourth guaranteed season in the contract. Paul George wanted this fourth year. The Clippers said that they were going to be unwilling to, not just for Paul George, but for any of their stars, give them a fourth year. They signed Kawhi Leonard to a contract extension during the season. That'll take him through the next 3 years. James Harden just signed a 2-year deal with a player option as well after this upcoming season. So, that money will shortly be off the Clippers' books as well. And that really just, this dispute opened the door for him to go to Philly, where it's not very often, it feels like, where we have teams with loads of loads of salary cap be able to go out in free agency nowadays, with sort of the limited player movement in free agency and more so about just re-upping for the money and maybe trading your way out of a situation. But Paul George saw the 76ers, who have a top 5-10 player in the league in Joel Embiid, with a blossoming all-star, potential all-NBA player in Tyrese Maxey, and sort of hitched his wagon to that to form one of the best big threes, if not the best big three, in the NBA next season. And I think that it is interesting here because obviously what we've seen from the past couple years, including with the Clippers, is that assembling a big three doesn't necessarily carry the same weight that at least the perception of what it did in years past, where we saw the Clippers sort of flame out the Phoenix Suns. Now they're going to be running it back next season with their big three of Booker, Durant, and Beal, but nobody really in the NBA community feels great about that decision. So it's definitely not the strategy that a lot of teams are mimicking right now, but at the same time, the 76ers had the money. Daryl Morey, their general manager, has long been a believer in this type of strategy. And again, I think that they really do play into each other's games very well, and that it's going to be a great fit. Now, it takes more than the big three. We'll see how they shake up the rest of their roster. I do like some of the sort of supplementary moves that they've made up to this point. I thought that the NBA draft went really well for them, getting two players that could potentially be rotational pieces in Jared McCain and Adem Bona. And then they have made some other moves in free agency as well. They brought back Kelly Oubre Jr., who had a nice season for Philly last season on a 2-year, $16 million deal. They brought in veterans and Eric Gordon and Andre Drummond as well. So the 76ers, again, are still going to have some distance to make up to some degree to shape out their roster. I mean, they came into this offseason with, I believe it was only 3 players that were under contract, and now we are starting to see a more solidified version of Philly that should be very competitive in the Eastern Conference. And that is something that I sort of want to, talk about as well with Paul George, is the fact that I do think there are going to be a number of people who sort of get down on him because of the fact that this is another situation where he is switching teams. I thought this was the right decision for Paul George, where you are leaving Kawhi Leonard in the Clippers, which obviously Kawhi has had his injury concerns over really the entirety of that run with the two of them in LA, and you're going to Joel Embiid, who has been even less healthy when the postseason comes around. But at the same time, the Eastern Conference is far more open than the Western Conference currently is. And I thought it was the right decision. There was some level of disrespect, and we're going to get into the Clippers side of this equation as well very shortly. But, through the contract negotiation process, Paul George felt disrespected by LA, and he didn't owe the Clippers anything, I would say. Obviously, you look at that trade that happened in 2019 of the number of different draft assets that the Thunder got in exchange for Paul George, and then you add in a superstar in Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, that it was a bad investment strategy from the Clippers. That being said, people do sort of forget the fact that it wasn't really just getting Paul George in return. It was also getting Kawhi Leonard. They were pretty much a package deal. There were rumors about Kawhi potentially going to the Lakers that offseason as well. That's when we were really sort of at the peak of this super team era with the Golden State Warriors, and I think that it was the right decision at the time. Now, the fact that internally they hadn't necessarily seen this level of production from Shai is where they went wrong. But again, that is a Clippers issue. That's not a Paul George issue. He just showed up and played. And overall, it was, I would say, a failure of an experiment of putting him and Kawhi Leonard together and winning just 3 playoff series in 5 years and being a first round exit a number of those years is absolutely disappointing. And I would say that this is, on par with the failure of the Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant situation that they went through that same offseason. But the difference is the Nets were just signing Kyrie and Kevin Durant in free agency, where the Thunder obviously were able to gain a number of assets, including an All-NBA player, in exchange for Paul George when the Clippers were trying to put together this super team with the two of them. I would argue that Paul George isn't the number one culprit in the fact that the Clippers did underachieve throughout his time there. Kawhi obviously was dealing with a number of different injuries that took him out in the majority of their postseason appearances, and that includes 2021 when the team made the Western Conference Finals after Kawhi went down with that knee injury that kept him out for the second half of that series against the Utah Jazz in the second round and the entire Western Conference Finals, and then leading into the next season as well. And, Paul George, he is sort of without his signature moment in the postseason up to this point. Now, he did have maybe the best postseason performance of his career in that run to the Western Conference Finals in 2021, where he scored 41 points in Game 5 of the finals, the conference finals against the Suns. He shot 75% from the field. So it did come with, a little bit of shine there, but still, ultimately, we're looking at Paul George, who is somebody whose legacy is just kind of really hard to define up to this point, because he's been an incredible player, and I do think that he gets disrespected, and the idea that now he is this negative asset. And that's where, for the Clippers, I think they should have given Paul George the 4th year on his contract and just gotten this done. Now, I do understand that from the Clippers' perspective, they were really concerned about the second apron of the luxury tax this offseason and moving forward, and especially in a few years from now. It's one thing when they are already almost, it feels like a little bit of a long shot to win, let's say, next season, but you're talking 3-4 years from now, if all of their money is wrapped up in Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, who are in their late 30s and haven't necessarily given you a ton to go off of in the first 5 years of this tandem anyways, that the Clippers want to avoid a situation where they are unable to make any moves and they're just riding it out with this old duo. But what I would say to that is, I think that Paul George is actually a pretty safe bet to still have value 4 years from now. I think his game is going to age pretty well. Really, if you look outside of obviously that horrific injury that he suffered when he was playing with Team USA at the end of his Pacers career, he has been very durable in my eyes, and I think that he has a play style that is going to continue to adapt as he becomes less physically dominant, but he is always going to be able to shoot. He's been an incredible off the ball offensive player, I would argue. Now he's been, more on the ball in recent years, especially as the Clippers have sort of been all in on him and Kawhi and the nucleus that they have in LA. When he goes to Philly, I do think he's going to be able to play off of Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid, and I love that fit there. I think that, worst case scenario, no, he's not necessarily a dominant defensive player at this point in his career, but I think that, a floor of a 3-and-D player that has a lot of experience. And again, listen, I understand all the concerns as to, what Paul George is and is not, but I feel a lot better about giving him the long-term money than I do James Harden, and definitely more than I do with Kawhi Leonard. Even though Kawhi is the better all-time talent, I just don't think that his game necessarily is going to be able to hold up like that. And I think that Paul George, next year he's going to be headed into his age 34 season, and I believe under contract through 37, 38, which can be maybe a little bit intimidating, but at the same time, I don't know. I just feel like the Clippers got just about nothing out of this entire experience. Now, they were able to stay relevant in a time where the Lob City era was coming to an end, and they were trying to, compete with the Lakers for attention in a time where LeBron James is also going to LA, and the Clippers have these plans to try and, build a new arena and establish a true new brand for themselves. It feels like this fell very flat. And again, outside of the Shai Gilgeous-Alexander piece, which is obviously a very big deal in this conversation, I do think that, when you look back to where we were at in 2019, it was a little bit of a no-brainer. And again, I don't even really care about the draft capital that they gave up maybe quite as much. The bigger thing is obviously trading a player in Shai Gilgeous-Alexander who, at least the past 2 years, but you can even make an argument for the entirety of this, of since that trade, Shai has maybe been the better overall player. But again, at the end of the day, I think that Paul George gets disrespected, and he is still more than capable of providing, winning basketball and an impact to a competitive team. And in the Eastern Conference, where we just saw last year, obviously you still have to overcome the Boston Celtics, but overall the conference is pretty vulnerable, and Philly should be in the middle of that contention next season. Again, still have some ways to go in terms of shaping out the rest of their roster. And that is sort of an idea that a lot of teams are trying to figure out, is how to operate in this new era of the luxury tax system. And you want to get your star players, but what are you going to surround them with? And that is the current question for the Los Angeles Lakers, as they are trying to put together a roster that can have a bounce back season. A lot of fresh faces in the building from a coaching standpoint, and they are hoping from a roster standpoint as well. And LeBron James declined his player option and is now looking to potentially take a pay cut with the Lakers to accommodate for the franchise to go after some other players. So we are going to be diving into what that search looks like, but first we have to take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.